The previous talks have given us a nice overview of carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, and its relationship to the goals of the Paris Agreement and to the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. I want to talk today about some of the governance challenges facing carbon dioxide removal as it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals and to sustainable development more generally. The first governance challenge I want to talk about is learning what we need to know. In order to govern carbon dioxide removal, CDR, for sustainability, we're going to need to learn a lot more about the relationship between the many different approaches to CDR and the Sustainable Development Goals. Specifically, we're going to have to drill down beyond the 17 high-level SDGs to think about the SDG indicators and their connection to CDR. So what does that mean? Let's look at an example. So think about SDG 2, which is informally known as Zero Hunger, and the official statement of which is end hunger, ensure food security and improve nutrition, and promote the Sustainable Development Goals. That is a complicated goal. And beneath the goal are a number of different targets, some of which you can see here. And then underlying each target is a set of indicators. These are quantifiable metrics by which the world can assess progress toward or movement away from a particular target or goal. So you can see the indicators for target 2.1 are prevalence of undernourishment and prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity measured in a particular way. And I think it's important to think about these indicators because these are what give us specific, quantifiable, and politically negotiated metrics by which to think about the relationship between CDR and the many different approaches to CDR and the SDGs or sustainable development generally, right? Even beyond the time frame of the SDGs themselves. Now, I mentioned the many different approaches to CDR, and I think the other way that we're going to have to get more specific when we're learning about the connections between CDR and SDGs is that we need to move beyond the assessment of CDR in terms of broad technological categories. What I mean is that so far, a lot of the assessment of CDR has focused on broad categories like soil carbon sequestration or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS as it's called, or direct air capture or enhanced weathering. But each of these technological categories can be implemented in many different ways and in many different contexts and with many different kinds of governance. And all of those things matter for the sustainability implications of CDR. So think about this figure from a great paper by Jan Minks and colleagues that came out in 2018. And across the top, you'll see some of these broad technological categories, right? Soil carbon sequestration, BECCS, and so on. And then underneath, you'll see just some of the ways in which those things can be implemented. So think about BECCS. Right? The biomass that's used to produce bioenergy for BECCS could come from many different sources. It might come from crop residues, things like rice husks or corn stover. It might come from dedicated energy crops. It might come from dedicated energy crops grown on marginal land. And all of those would have really important implications for the sustainability of BECCS. And it's only when we drill down to this level of these sort of narrowly defined technologies that we can really begin to flesh out the connections between CDR and the Sustainable Development Goals or sustainable development more generally. In fact, what you'd really want to do is think about one of these narrowly defined technologies in a particular context with a particular kind of governance, what scholars of science and technology studies would call a socio-technical system. To be a bit less academic about that, another way to think about it is in terms of specific projects. So what are the sustainability implications, say, of a corn ethanol plant in the Midwestern United States that's capturing CO2 from the fermentation of corn and injecting it into a deep saline aquifer. This is an actual project. Here's another example. What are the sustainability implications of a large coal-fired power plant in England that converts to run on biomass, captures that carbon and injects it into, say, a depleted oil and gas reservoir? Now, what are the implications of that project if the biomass in question is wood pellets manufactured in the southern United States and shipped over to England? All of these things matter, and it's only when you get to that level of detail and connect it to something as nuanced as the sustainable development indicators, the SDG indicators, that you really get a concrete picture of the sustainability implications of these technologies. And so when we go to try to learn what we need to know to govern CDR for sustainability, we need to drill down to that level of detail. The second challenge that I want to talk about is choosing the right baskets of CDR. And again, this also has two parts to it. So on the one hand, we want to choose the right mix of approaches for the right place. This means that we want to find the technologies, again, narrowly defined, that are well suited to a particular jurisdiction, a particular community, or a particular country, given their particular circumstances. Because even if one technology works better than another in one place, the opposite might be true in another place. Even if one technology looks like it might be the best in the abstract, right, or on a global average, that might not be true in a particular context. And so you want to make sure that you've got the right mix of approaches in each particular community or country. But the other side of choosing the right baskets of CDR is making sure the baskets are the right size, as it were. That is, making sure that we are doing the right amount of CDR. Here's how I think about that in the context of sustainable development, or the SDGs. Climate change itself is a major threat to the SDGs and to sustainable development. CDR is a way to reduce climate change, and so reduce that threat to sustainable development. And yet, with a lot of the approaches to CDR, as they scale up, right, as they reach a very large scale, they can also pose threats to sustainable development and to the SDGs. The most obvious examples here are that some approaches to CDR, like BECCS, are going to compete for land, especially arable land. And that could have serious effects on food prices and so on food security and hunger. Some of the other approaches, like, say, direct air capture, some approaches to enhanced weathering, might require a lot of energy. And so they might compete with attempts to deliver clean energy to people who need it and ensure energy security. And so the question is how we find the right balance between those things, right? How do we make sure we're doing the right amount of CDR to do what we can to limit climate change in this way, right, in addition to abatement, without doing so much that you are endangering sustainable development? And I think one of the key considerations here is that you've got to choose the right comparison scenario. That is, if you are trying to think about the sustainability implications of removing, say, 100 gigatons of carbon over some period of time, you've got to think about what would be the case if we weren't doing that. It wouldn't be exactly the same climate and exactly the same amount of abatement, just no CDR. Right? It would be some mix of maybe the climate would be a little bit different, more climate change. Maybe we would have to do a little bit more abatement. Right? But you've got to choose those comparisons carefully to get a real picture of what the sustainability implications of that amount of CDR would be in that particular scenario. The third challenge that I want to talk about is managing CDR for sustainability. What I mean here is that even once we've chosen the right mix of approaches for a particular place, it's going to take active governance to promote positive impacts and safeguard against negative impacts. Now, in a lot of cases, a lot of jurisdictions are already going to have governance processes in place, governance mechanisms in place to govern CDR for sustainability, because the sustainability implications of most CDR activities are going to resemble sustainability issues that apply to other activities. And so lots of places will already have governance mechanisms in place to handle this. In other places, there's still capacity building to be done, but it's capacity building that would apply to any attempt to ensure sustainable development, right? Not just for CDR. I do want to mention, though, 3 issues that are especially important for sustainable governance of CDR for sustainability. Right? The first is incentivizing, recognizing, and rewarding sustainable CDR. Some examples of this might be finding ways to integrate CDR into national or subnational or private net zero commitments, or integrating CDR into carbon pricing or carbon trading schemes, or integrating it more clearly into the Paris Agreement in ways that genuinely prioritize sustainable CDR. So the concern here, part of the concern here, is that if the incentive mechanisms treat every ton of CO2 that's sequestered in the same way, people are going to optimize for tons of CO2 per dollar. And that's not necessarily going to align with sustainability criteria. Right? You're not going to end up with the most sustainable approaches to CDR, or even with CDR that is really compatible with sustainable development, if that's the way you incentivize it. The second governance issue I want to discuss is governance of the oceans. So the oceans are critical for delivering a number of the sustainable development goals. And they might also end up playing a big role in CDR because the oceans already hold a lot of carbon and they could hold a lot more. And existing international governance mechanisms, to my mind, are not all the way there when it comes to governing CDR in international waters, right? This is a global commons, and so there's still work to do in making sure that that can be governed for sustainability. The final issue I want to talk about is managing impacts on global markets. I alluded to this earlier. Some of the most important ways in which CDR might affect sustainable development and the SDGs is through indirect impacts that operate through global markets, like global markets for food or for land. And as I see it, existing mechanisms for managing these sorts of impacts are not adequate yet. And so there's more work to be done in ensuring international cooperation to ensure that CDR doesn't negatively impact sustainable development in these ways. So to sum up, I've highlighted 3 of the governance challenges for governing CDR for sustainability. First, learning what we need to know. We need to get more specific in order to understand the connection between particular ways of doing CDR in particular places and their quantifiable impacts on specific aspects of the SDGs or sustainable development. Second, choosing the right baskets of CDR, which means both making sure we're doing the right amount of CDR and ensuring that we've chosen the right mix of CDR for particular communities or countries, given their particular circumstances. And finally, I've talked about managing CDR for sustainability using existing and new governance mechanisms and processes to ensure that we are genuinely prioritizing sustainable CDR as we strive to reach our climate and sustainable development goals.